Welcome in. I'm Colette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Steve is the author of Late Talking Children, A Symptom or a Stage. This book now in its second edition. Today we're going to talk about early childhood services. For some late talking children, it's a stage they pass through. For others, it's a symptom of something else. We do know that many of these kids will need resources in early childhood. So let's talk about the benefits there.
So for about half or a little less than half of the children, the late talking is actually a symptom of something that's going to require extra support. Now, really for all late talking children, whether it's a symptom or a stage, I advise parents to learn some parent coaching techniques and things that are going to help them engage their child and help support their language development as they go along. And these things like Hannon training or other kinds of training, some resources are on the Late Talker website, Late Talker Children Foundation website. So that can be for everybody. But some late talkers are going to need extra support. So then the families have to reach out and get other people to help them with their late talker journey.
When a parent's considering having their child evaluated, is going through a private or a public institution better?
So you can get good services at both places, and you can also have some things that aren't necessarily optimal at either place as well. What's really important, whether it's private or it's public, is that the clinician doing the evaluation is open-minded about whether it's a symptom or a stage. And then if they're looking, they're trying to do a differential diagnosis for a symptom, that they're open to several different possibilities, that they're not just saying everybody who's a late talking child has autism, or everyone has intellectual disability, or whatever it is. You want to have someone that is actually conducting a differential diagnosis to try to understand what's causing the late talking, and then that'll help them to figure out the best treatment for that child.
How old does a child have to be in order to get a, let's call it a public evaluation through a public institution?
So the way the services are organized, it can be a little confusing. So in terms of the public services, from birth until 3, they're offered through what's called early intervention services. And that's through the Developmental Pediatric Network. And oftentimes when there's an evaluation, if the child needs services, someone will come to their home to help them. And then once a child turns 3, they transition into what's called preschool services. And from 3 to 5, they might have a preschool classroom or a mix of services. And then once they hit kindergarten, then they transition into school services. So unfortunately, they might have a good service situation, say in preschool, and then they have to redo the whole thing in school age. And so that can really be a challenge navigating that. So there's a transition when the child turns 3, and then another transition when the child hits kindergarten at age 5 or 6. In the birth to 3, I'm saying birth, well, let's say a child has Down syndrome. Now, children with Down syndrome are late talking, so they are late talking children, but they have Down syndrome. When they're born, early intervention services might happen just because it's clear that people with Down syndrome have a different learning path, and they're wonderful people. They need extra support, so that can be in place right away. Typically what happens is that when a child hits 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, and they're not talking, that's when parents will probably engage the service provision network, whether it's private or public.
What does the support look like for a child at school? Is it one-on-one therapy? Is it all in a classroom?
So there's a range of different options. So some can be one-on-one. Some can be a small group of other children, late talking children who have a similar symptom profile. Other times it can be a blend of children who aren't late talking and are learning more typically within the late talking children, and everything in between. So part of the navigation is that, again, you want to have an accurate diagnosis so you know what treatment is going to come. Different diagnoses require different treatments, so it's really important to understand that. And then, looking at the different support systems and trying to figure out the best option for your child. And so that's going to be you trusting your own instincts, and then also getting good answers from the people that are recommending the placements.
There's a big transition from preschool into kindergarten, whether you were at home with your child before going to kindergarten or you were at preschool. It's a big jump, right? So what are some of the biggest challenges that families with late talking children are going to face in that transition?
So it's certainly true in preschool, but even more so in kindergarten, first grade, particularly educational pressure, if you will, educational acceleration makes it particularly challenging on late talkers. So if you look at the education in our country, what used to be in first grade is now being taught in kindergarten. And so you can go back and look at the 1960s when I was in school, and you look at what a kindergarten curriculum looks like, a first grade curriculum, and so on. Now we've actually gotten a whole year ahead. Late talking children have a very uneven profile, if you will. They're often ahead in some things, particularly visual spatial things. They're usually behind in terms of things that relate to listening. Many of them, about half of them, have trouble learning to read. And so if you're trying to accelerate that, they're at a particular disadvantage. And so a late talking child who otherwise is going to do well if you just give them more time might look particularly behind when you're transitioning into those school age services. A lot of times in kindergarten, for example, they'll have the students write little journals. And most late talking children are simply not ready to do that. They'll be able to write when they're a little bit older, a little bit more time, and part of this is trying to buy time. But they can look really behind if that's the expectation for the kindergarten. So it's very difficult. The other thing is we call it eligibility. So the birth to 3 has one eligibility, preschool has another eligibility. Then they have to get tested again to be eligible for school services. And so they may have been kind of a generic eligibility, like general developmental delay or something like that. But then a lot of times a more specific label can be pushed on the children and the family when they get into school services. Particularly if the child is behind in some areas, then the schools are going to be really anxious about that. Unfortunately, in America, school is really a high-stakes enterprise. And so I know here in Nashville, when they have achievement testing, and different schools get graded on how well they do on the achievement testing. So if a child's a little behind, then that's going to affect the teacher's rating, and that's going to be public. And so it's like it makes them really anxious about having children that are learning differently in their classrooms, and that can really affect late talking children.
Beyond kindergarten, what sort of changes do you see in teaching styles versus learning patterns for late talkers?
So the preschool and early school age services and education is really geared to having children follow a classroom routine that's geared for non-late talking children. By that I mean it's very routine based. A lot of the instruction is going to be having the children sit in desks or sit on a circle time and listen to the instructor give verbal lessons, which is good for children whose learning style matches that. That's really not how most late talkers learn the most efficient. In fact, sit still and listen is probably the least optimal style of learning for a late talker. And so because all the pressure's on that and all the process is designed to accommodate that and acclimate a child to that learning style, it can be so difficult for a late talking child and their families when all they're hearing about is how their children aren't learning, how there's a problem in the classroom. When if you use a different learning style that isn't sit still and listen, they may do very well. Late talking children learn by doing, and so you want a hands-on type of an educational experience.
So it's not always about the substance that they're learning, it's the way it's being delivered to them that's the challenge.
Yeah, so human beings are successful because we have a lot of variability in our strengths and weaknesses. And late talkers are really an example of that. So many late talking children are quite good visually spatial, and many of them are either at grade level or above grade level in subjects like math and science. Whereas in verbally related things like social studies and things like that, they might be a little bit behind. And so that kind of asynchronous or diverse learning style is different than other children. And so the schools are designed to teach kind of the average or general child. And if your child's not fitting that profile, it's just not going to be a good match.
Now, we've talked about children passing through. It's just a stage of late talking. So they may outgrow that, but they don't always outgrow some of the characteristics, the behavior patterns. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so late talking children generally, even if when it's a stage, they tend to have a learning style where they immerse themselves in something and want to keep doing something until they master it. They tend to have a lot of self-confidence in what they know, and that can be a challenge for teachers and for parents and so on. They tend to be strong-willed on average, and again, this can be a good thing, although it can also be really challenging if you're trying to get them to be compliant with particularly something they don't see the point of. Also, they don't necessarily, with a late talking child, you might say to them, let's say a preschooler, and all these children are, say, over here on a swing or they're playing a game. You might say to that late talking child, look, all those other children are doing this, and other children will want to join in on that. A late talking child will think if they want to join or not. So if they're interested in what their children are doing, they'll join in. But if it's not something they're interested in, they won't feel the pressure to join in just for the social part of it. And it's not that they have autism, it's that the late talking children kind of have this different way of learning, and they have this kind of self-confidence that makes them a little bit more focused on what they want to do and having their own interests.
A lot of parents might hear this word or this abbreviation, IEP, which stands for Individualized Education Plan. So if you can kind of just elaborate, what is it and why might it be necessary for late talkers?
So in the educational process, the first step is the child is made eligible for services. Now, it's important to know that it's not a diagnosis. There's these different categories, and as long as the child can be made eligible for that, they're then given services. So the IEP is actually a plan that's written up. It's in law. It's a national law that everybody who gets special services has to have this. And so in that plan, you have eligibility. So why is your child getting the services? You have goals. So what are they supposed to learn, and what are the accommodations, and what are the supports? And then you have placement. Where are these services going to be delivered? And the individual education plan, or IEP, is actually a contract between the school and the parents as to how their late talking child is going to be supported at school. And so it's really important that parents understand this, understand the process, because a lot of times it works well. I don't want parents to go in and immediately not listen to what's being said, because many times it works well. But sometimes what will happen is that, for example, there'll be a late talking child who can be made eligible for autism, but a developmental pediatrician or somebody who's trained in differential diagnosis of autism doesn't think they have autism. And then they'll be put into kind of a standard autism program where they're going to be in a classroom that doesn't include other children. It only will have children with autism or autistic children. And they may have a learning style that's geared for children that have a low motivation for social interaction. Well, their late talker may be really social, so that might really not be a good match for them. And so sometimes the IEP is kind of a preordained package, and so parents want to be cautious about that. I do want to say, too, that parents do have rights. Sadly, I've been in IEP meetings where it almost feels like, it's a strong word, but almost like bullying, where there's a big group of people that are trying to push the parents into accepting a placement and a package that they don't agree with, and there'll be a lot of pressure to do that. So parents don't have to sign the IEP. So you want to make sure that you're working as a team, and a lot of times, like for us with our late talking child, so many times it worked well. It was very collaborative. We were really happy with what we got. On the other hand, I am involved in cases where it's just really a mismatch and it gets to be kind of a tug of war. But parents have a lot of rights, and so it's important to know your rights, and it's important when you need to actually kind of stand up for your late talker and assert your rights.
And so taking that information and looking at schools when you're considering enrolling your child, you said make sure there's similar children, right, in the classroom that your child's going to be in.
Yeah, so it's really important that parents visit a classroom, talk to the teacher, talk to the principal, and get a feel for the culture of the school when they're considering having their child there. And so a child with really high learning needs, they may be in a classroom with other children with high learning needs. There may be children who learn more slowly, things like that. All children should be integrated to the largest extent possible with other children who are learning more typically. That's actually a right. It's one of the principles in the law, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. All these acronyms get thrown around. So parents have a right to have their children in what's called the least restrictive environment. And that sounds like a technical term, but what it means is that their children have a right to be with other children who are learning typically. And it's really important to do that to the largest extent possible because the outcomes are better. We have lots of data on that. So it's certainly true that children might have to be in special tutoring classes and so on for some things. Some children can't be in the regular classroom at all because of their education needs or sometimes because of their physical needs. But we always want to have that as a goal. That's really, really important. And so what happens a lot of times is that a child will get an eligibility and then they'll all be put in a separate classroom and they don't get to interact with other children that are learning more typically. And again, we only want to do that when that's really essential for that child in terms of their support needs. schools are well-meaning. A lot of schools are great, but often, it's hard sometimes to have children with different learning needs in a regular classroom. And, there's things like teacher aides and things that are needed for that. And so I can understand why they might necessarily have that as their first choice, but parents have a right to that if their child can learn in that environment.
You encourage parents to make sure that the teachers and all of the support staff around them are friendly.
It's really, really important that parents feel that the teachers and the school are happy to have them there. It's so foundational. Even when a child has learning differences, it's important for parents to hear about green flags, for parents to hear about things their child can do and how the teacher's going to build on that. I mean, you think about a first grader walking into a classroom. They don't know second grade math. They don't know, third grade grammar and so on. There's a developmental process there, and teachers do that, and they encourage that, and they nurture that. Well, maybe your late talker's doing kindergarten writing, so they need a little extra help, but it still needs to be a positive, supportive environment. The late talking child shouldn't be viewed as a problem or a nuisance, and the family shouldn't be viewed as a problem or a nuisance. They should be viewed as a valued member of the learning community. It's really important. And I got to tell you, I walk into some schools, it's just so obvious that's how they feel. Other schools, anybody who's learning a little differently, that's a problem. We hear a lot about red flags, and there's just not as nurturing a philosophy as one would hope for.
Well, you said make sure that parents ask, are children strapped into chairs or subjected to other strange practices at the school that you're looking at?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's some outdated and non-evidence-based philosophies that you actually have to restrain a child and force them to talk and force them to learn using restraint. It makes me really upset when I see that because it's a total violation of the children's rights. Anyway, if you see children being strapped into chairs as part of your visit, just cross that school off the list, and to be honest with you, immediately turn around and actually, if you feel like you can actually maybe write a letter to the school district, letting them know that they're doing that kind of stuff. It's just, when I walk into Vanderbilt Hospital, there's a sign on the wall that says that my child has a right to be free from restraint unless it's medically indicated. And there's nothing to show that you have to restrain a child to teach them how to talk. We have hundreds of studies in the literature where there's no restraint whatsoever, and it's very effective. As a contrast, my oldest, another child hit him with a swing and it cut his eye. And so they had to strap him to a board in order so he wouldn't move so they could do the stitches properly. So that's medically indicated. But forcing a child strapping him into a chair to force them to talk is just inhumane. And sadly, it does happen. The other thing you want to avoid is if they have timeout rooms or isolation rooms. A good behavioral support team can support a child in the regular classroom. It can take, or in a separate classroom, it can take some effort, but you don't have to put them in an isolation room. Again, that's inhumane treatment. So sadly, those things exist. If you see them, do not put your late talking child in that school.
Your advice in the book is to avoid classrooms and clinicians that do not align with how you want your child taught or treated. And it sounds like, you just explained a little bit there, but can you expand on that, please?
Sure. So if your child is going into school and they're crying, now when they first go in, you go to the first day of preschool or whatever, some of the kids are, they're worried about their mom. And so I'm not talking about that. In fact, I remember when I went to kindergarten, there were kids getting on the bus crying. And I thought, I went to kindergarten, I was 4, and I was like, okay, that didn't bother me. But there were kids getting on the bus. Mom was crying. The kids were crying. Okay. But after they're in school for a little bit, then, it's really important that, they are happy and that they're willing to go in. How do you learn if you're always upset all the time? Sometimes parents aren't allowed to watch, for example, when their child goes to a clinic or goes for therapy, and they may hear their child crying or screaming down the hallway. That shouldn't be what it is. And parents should always be able to watch to see what's happening with their children. That's really important. Again, I can tell you that I've seen literally thousands of children over the years, and I've never put them in restraints. And, children just don't like scream and cry when I'm working with them. So I can just And again, I mean, we have lots of data on this. You just don't need to be doing that to force a child. So you should have a positive working relationship with the school, with the clinicians, and so on. And that child is entitled to basic human dignity and human rights. It's really important and should never be forgotten. It's easy, someone says, hey, I've got to strap this child in there so they'll learn. I had one clinician tell me that it was just too hard to chase the child around the classroom to teach them, so they strap them in the chair, and someone might give you a plausible reason why they're doing that. And it's easy to kind of be led down the garden path and have a suspension of disbelief. But nah, if your child's crying and upset and they're strapping them in chairs or doing other things that make them upset, you just don't need to do that to teach children. Certainly not how to teach them how to talk. And really, generally, you don't need to do that to teach them. So,
how do you feel about homeschooling?
So homeschooling is really a great option. Actually, now with COVID, a lot of families are doing homeschooling just because of the natural progress of not being in school for a bit, and they've learned about it. In fact, my oldest son is homeschooling his 3 children, or I should say his wife, who's a teacher, is homeschooling them. He helps, of course, but she's the main person doing it. So let me say it this way. If you can homeschool, it's a good option, and I would really encourage you to do that. If you think about it, the student-teacher ratio is favorable, unless you're in my family. I had 7 children, so probably they're a better option. No, I'm just teasing. But most families, we know that learning is a product of the number of teaching opportunities, and it's just a matter of mathematics and statistics. If you're homeschooled, that child is going to have more one-on-one types of interactions, and we know that boosts learning. So if you can do that, great. If you can't do it, I don't want you to have guilt, because a lot of people can't homeschool, and we can make schools work, and it's fine if you get a good school. The thing I really want to emphasize, though, is that our people who are homeschooling their children, where someone comes in and says, oh, you need to not homeschool them, you need to send them to that school for socialization or whatever it is, that's not necessarily good advice. In other words, if you can homeschool your child, that's really a good option. And if it's working well, you shouldn't abandon that because someone says, oh, you need to send them to a regular school so they'll be socialized, particularly in preschool, because preschool kids are typical preschool kids really aren't all that social anyway. They do parallel play, and if you put them in that preschool, it may not match their learning needs, and they're not going to get that individual attention that you get from being with your parent at home. And so homeschooling is a great option. I really encourage it. If you can do it, do it. If you can't do it, it's fine. Don't have guilt. But if you can and you want to, don't let anybody talk you out of it.
Is there a way for parents of late talkers to get trained at home so they can provide the support that their child needs?
So as part of the evaluation process, the clinician should always be offering home support, whether the parent's going to be homeschooling or not. There's courses on parenting and homeschool. There's courses on like on the Late Talker Foundation website. There's courses there to help parents understand how to interact with their children to accelerate their talking. So yes, there's a lot of resources available. There's homeschool co-ops. There's just a ton of stuff, and it's getting more and more. I mean, in other words, there's kind of the societal embracing of homeschooling now. By the way, we also have a couple of really good large studies now showing that homeschool children are slightly but significantly ahead of children in school, to the best of our knowledge. And so we know, I'm not saying homeschooling is going to create geniuses, but I am going to say that it's really clear it's not inhibitory. So in other words, my point is that you're homeschooling a child, if you do it and follow a curriculum, and there's curriculum available, is a great option, and it absolutely will not hurt your child. And in fact, there seems to be some benefits.
Is early intervention or preschool mandatory for the little ones? So
it's not mandatory. So that's one of the reasons you want to be a good consumer of it. So if you find yourself with a late talking child, and your best guess is it's a symptom, and you're trying to get support, if it's the wrong kind of support, you don't have to take that. And so, in fact, if the services are great, we encourage parents to take it. If the services aren't great or a mismatch, we recommend they turn those services down. And again, the parent really is the one that has to sign off on it in the end. And we talked about an individual education plan, and there's going to be a team that puts that together, but the parents do have to give their consent and approval to it. And again, you just want to be sure you're a partner in that and not treat it as a problem or somebody who's standing against what the school wants to do if the parent feels like it's not a good match for their child.
Well, some parents might think that programs or services are the only successful way to get their late talking child caught up. Can you give your opinion on that?
So if late talking is just a stage, lots of studies show they're going to catch up. Again, they'll have a late talker profile. There's a really great longitudinal study where looking at preschoolers all the way through high school, and the late talkers caught up in terms of being in the same range, but they had a relative weakness in their language relative to visual, spatial, other kinds of subjects. So there was a little bit of a gap, but they were well within the typical range. They didn't need services or anything for their language once they really actually hit school, that particular cohort. And so they don't necessarily need anything special for it. If it's a symptom, then the education system really has to match the support needs. Now, what I mean is, so for example, let's take, a child with ADHD. If a child with ADHD has attention problems, then we have to give them more learning opportunities that are optimal because they're only going to get a fraction and process. So in other words, like, let's say I'm teaching them a word, let's say like cup, and I hold up the cup. Well, the first few times I do that, they might be distracted. So I have to do cup like 100 times for them to learn it. And then it gets in their long-term memory. And so I have to kind of match the child's learning with their symptoms or the challenges that are preventing the talking. And I have to be a good detective to do that. And I want the early education system to do that for the child.
We're going to talk more about early childhood services. There's so much to cover in this realm. So that's going to come up next. Our next podcast, we're going to talk about labels and IEPs. So we hope that you'll tune in for that. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. Please continue to ask us questions in the comment section and be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss anything. Hit that bell. And you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And always remember, the best thing for your child is you.